Nathan had always considered himself an understanding husband. He never questioned Sophie's need for space, never scrolled through her phone, never doubted her word. After nearly 15 years of marriage, he figured trust was the foundation they had built their life upon. But trust, he was beginning to realize, could sometimes be the perfect disguise for betrayal. It started on a Wednesday evening. Over dinner, "I was thinking," Sophie began, twirling her fork through her quinoa salad, not quite meeting his eyes. "I need a break." Nathan looked up from his plate. "A break?" she exhaled, shaking her head slightly, as if the weight of the world sat on her shoulders. "I've been feeling off, drained, like I'm losing myself." She finally met his gaze, her brown eyes filled with something that almost looked like sadness. "I need to disconnect, just for a weekend. No phone, no emails, no stress." Nathan frowned, his gut tightening just slightly. "Where would you go?" "There's this retreat I found online. It's secluded, no distractions, just meditation, nature walks, yoga. I think it could be really good for me." There was nothing inherently wrong with the idea. If anything, it sounded like something she would enjoy. But something about the way she said it, the overly rehearsed tone, the way she avoided direct eye contact, it sent a ripple of unease through him. "You're leaving your phone behind?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. "That's the whole point, Nathan." She sighed, pushing her plate aside. "I just need time away from everything, from technology, from responsibilities, even from us. Just for a couple of days. It's self-care." Self-care. He had always encouraged Sophie to take care of herself. She did yoga, went for spa treatments, even took solo trips before. But this felt different. "When would you leave?" "Friday morning, back by Sunday night." She leaned forward, resting her hand on his. "I hope you understand. I just need to breathe." Nathan forced a smile. "Of course." But as Sophie smiled back, relief flickering in her expression, the knot in Nathan's stomach only tightened. Friday morning came, and Nathan helped Sophie pack her bags. She hummed as she moved around the bedroom, folding light, flowy dresses into her suitcase, slipping in bottles of expensive skincare products. "Do you need me to drive you?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe, watching her carefully. She zipped up her bag and shook her head. No, I want to take my time getting there. Maybe stop for coffee on the way." He nodded, walking her out to their shared SUV. He kissed her goodbye, watching as she drove off, waving at him from the window. Nathan stayed outside for a while, staring at the driveway long after she was gone. Something about this entire situation felt staged, like she had been setting the scene for weeks, making sure every detail was in place. He shook his head, exhaling. "Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe I'm just being paranoid." But the feeling wouldn't go away. That evening, after putting away the dishes from his lonely dinner, he found himself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. A normal husband would trust his wife. A normal husband wouldn't check. But a fool would ignore the signs. Before he could second-guess himself, Nathan opened the tracking app they had installed for emergencies. The screen loaded, and a blinking dot appeared on the map. His heart stopped. She wasn't at a remote retreat. She was at a luxury spa resort 3 hours away. Nathan sat there, gripping the edge of the table, the world tilting slightly around him. She had lied, and now he needed to know why. Nathan's breath came slow and deliberate as he stared at the blinking dot on the GPS map. His fingers hovered over the screen, his mind racing through a dozen explanations. Some rational, others born from a place of growing suspicion. Maybe it's a mistake. Maybe she stopped there for gas or lunch. But the truth lay heavy in his gut. Sophie wasn't at some remote, off-the-grid retreat meditating under the trees. She was at a luxury spa resort, the kind of place couples went to unwind, where romance was built into the atmosphere. His heart pounded in his ears as he zoomed in on the map, confirming the location. The Monarch Spa and Resort. He knew the name. Sophie had mentioned it once in passing, saying she'd love to go there one day when we can afford to splurge. The irony wasn't lost on him now. Apparently they, or rather she, had found a reason to splurge after all. Nathan closed his eyes, inhaling deeply through his nose. A part of him still resisted what seemed obvious. He wanted to believe there was another explanation, some logical, innocent reason she was there. But doubt had already sunk its claws into him, and it wasn't letting go. "I need to see for myself." Without another thought, He grabbed his keys and jacket. The drive would take 3 hours, plenty of time to think, but right now, he wasn't sure he wanted to. The highway stretched long and endless in the evening light. The low hum of the tires against the pavement did little to quiet the storm raging inside his head. Memories played on a loop. Small things that suddenly took on a different meaning. Her recent distance, the late-night showers, the way she kept her phone screen tilted away from him. Had he been blind, or had he simply chosen to ignore the warning signs? Nathan gripped the wheel tighter. Don't assume the worst until you see it with your own eyes. As he neared the city, he glanced at the time. 7:43 p.m. If Sophie had truly been disconnecting, then she wouldn't be out exploring the nightlife. She'd be inside, tucked away in some private corner of the resort, convinced that no one was watching. The Monarch came into view just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The resort was everything its reputation promised. Grand, exclusive, a shimmering paradise nestled between rolling hills. A long driveway led up to the main building, where golden light spilled out onto a manicured courtyard. Nathan parked at a distance, far from the valet station, where he could sit unnoticed. For a moment he stayed in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. What am I even doing? He almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. He was about to play detective in his own marriage, something he never thought he'd have to do. Still, he stepped out of the car. Nathan entered the resort's lounge, blending into the flow of guests moving between the lobby and bar. The air smelled of expensive perfume, freshly cut flowers, and the lingering aroma of gourmet meals. Couples sat in intimate booths, leaning in close, whispering over wine glasses. The soft melody of a jazz band played in the background, wrapping the space in an almost dreamlike ambience. He forced himself to keep moving, his pulse hammering in his throat. Find her. See the truth. His gaze flickered over the guests, scanning the room. And then, there she was, Sophie, sitting poolside, bathed in the golden glow of overhead lanterns. Her silk robe was draped loosely over her shoulders, her legs crossed, posture relaxed. She was smiling, really smiling, in a way Nathan hadn't seen in years. And next to her, reclining in a chair with a drink in hand, was a man. Nathan didn't need an introduction to know who he was. Eric. His stomach twisted. Sophie had mentioned Eric in passing, a colleague she worked with on a few projects. Nathan had never met him, never had a reason to question their interactions. Until now. Eric leaned in, saying something too quiet for Nathan to hear. Sophie tilted her head, laughing softly, her hand resting lightly on Eric's arm. The way she looked at him, comfortable, familiar, intimate, was a look Nathan once believed was reserved only for him. His vision blurred at the edges. It wasn't just the betrayal itself. It was the ease with which she carried it out. The way she had woven this fantasy of self-care and spiritual healing while secretly indulging in another man's touch. Nathan took a slow step back, inhaling sharply through his nose, his hands curled into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. Not here, not now. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and lifted it just enough to capture the moment. He took 3 photos. One of Sophie laughing, one of her hand on Eric's arm, and one of them, toasting their drinks together. Proof. Undeniable. For a long moment he simply stood there, gripping the phone so tightly it hurt. Then without another word he turned and walked away. Back in his car, Nathan stared at the photos on his screen. He could feel his heartbeat in his ears, a steady drum of anger and something dangerously close to heartbreak. He should have confronted her. He should have walked up, thrown her lies in her face, demanded answers, but there was something more powerful about letting her think she had gotten away with it, because now he controlled the next move. Nathan sat back, exhaling slowly. He knew exactly what he was going to do next. Nathan drove home in silence, his grip on the steering wheel steady, his face expressionless, but inside he was anything but calm. The images of Sophie and Eric, laughing, touching, completely oblivious to the man who had loved her for 15 years, burned into his mind like hot iron branding flesh. A confrontation could have happened right there at the resort. He could have walked up to their little poolside paradise, slammed Eric's drink off the table, and demanded Sophie explain herself. But no, that would have given them control, allowed them to spin excuses, feign innocence, or worse, paint him as the overreacting husband. She doesn't know I was there. She doesn't know I saw everything. That gave him the power, and he was going to use it. Nathan spent the next day setting the stage. He printed the photos, slipping them into a manila folder with deliberate care. He gathered old anniversary cards, love notes Sophie had once written him, even an old text thread where she had promised him, "You're my forever." The irony wasn't lost on him. He also made calls, one to her sister Claire, whom Sophie had always confided in, one to her best friend Olivia, a woman who had once sworn to Nathan that Sophie would never do something like that, and one to Sophie's parents, who had always adored him and believed their daughter had married a good man. He didn't explain much over the phone, just a simple invitation. "Hey, I need to talk to you about something important. Can you come over for dinner tomorrow night?" By the time he finished making arrangements, Sophie's return was only hours away. Game on. Sunday evening arrived, and so did Sophie. Nathan sat in the living room, sipping a whiskey he barely tasted as he listened to the garage door hum open. A moment later, he heard the familiar sound of her suitcase wheels rolling across the floor, followed by her voice, cheerful, light, as if the weekend had been everything she had hoped for. "Hey babe," she called out. "I'm home." Nathan didn't move. A second later, Sophie stepped into the living room, her face lighting up at the sight of him. She was dressed comfortably in leggings and a sweater, her hair swept into a loose ponytail, the look of a woman who had spent the weekend disconnecting. She set her purse down, walked over, and leaned down to kiss him on the cheek. Nathan turned his head away. The first flicker of unease crossed her face. "Everything okay?" she asked, straightening up. Nathan finally met her eyes. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he reached to the coffee table, picked up the manila folder, and tossed it onto her lap. Sophie frowned, confused, then opened it. Nathan watched in silence as she flipped through the photos. The first was a shot of her and Eric sitting by the pool. The next, Eric's hand resting lightly on her thigh. The last, their drinks raised in a toast. Her smile radiant and full of something that looked a hell of a lot like love. Her face drained of color. "Nathan, don't." His voice was low, cold. She swallowed, looking up at him, her hands trembling slightly. "I can explain." "No," he cut her off. "You can't, and honestly I don't want to hear it." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Sophie's mouth opened, but no words came out. "You lied," Nathan continued, his tone eerily calm. "You said you were going on a retreat to disconnect, but instead you were in a 5-star resort, reconnecting with him." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "So tell me, Sophie, when did this start?" Sophie's breath hitched. "Nathan, it's not what you think." Nathan let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Really? Because what I think is that my wife has been sneaking around with another man, smiling like she hasn't in years, all while pretending that our marriage still means something to her." Her lower lip trembled. I was going to tell you." He tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "When? After one more weekend with him? After you figured out if he was worth leaving me for?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "I never wanted to hurt you." Nathan stared at her, something in his chest twisting painfully. "But you did." The weight of those 3 words hung heavy in the room. Sophie looked down at the pictures again, as if seeing the evidence made it all more real. And then, as if on cue, the doorbell rang. Sophie flinched. "Who is that?" Nathan rose from his seat. "Our guest." The color drained from her face as he walked to the door and opened it. Claire, Olivia, and Sophie's parents stood on the porch. They looked between Nathan and Sophie, the tension in the air palpable. "What's going on?" Claire asked hesitantly. Nathan stepped aside, letting them enter. "Ask her." Sophie's breath came fast and shallow. "Nathan." He gestured to the coffee table, where the photos lay in plain view. "Go ahead, Sophie. Tell them where you really were this weekend." Claire stepped forward first, picking up the photos, her eyes widening with each one. Olivia gasped, bringing a hand to her mouth. Sophie's mother let out a quiet, disbelieving, "Oh my God." Sophie sat frozen, her hands clenched in her lap. "Nathan, you didn't have to." "Yes, I did," he interrupted. "You made sure your betrayal was private, hidden behind excuses and lies. But I want the truth out in the open. Tears spilled down her cheeks. You don't understand, Nathan exhaled sharply. You keep saying that, Sophie, but you're the one who doesn't understand. You don't understand what you've done. You don't understand how much this destroys everything we built. Her father cleared his throat, his face lined with disappointment. Sophie, how could you? Sophie let out a small, broken sob. I never meant for this to happen. Nathan's expression hardened. But it did. He straightened, his voice firm. And now there are consequences. Sophie looked up, eyes wide with fear. What do you mean? Nathan walked to the mantel, grabbed a second folder and tossed it beside the first. Those are the divorce papers, he said flatly. The silence in the room was deafening. Sophie's shoulders shook, her face crumpling. Nathan, please. He shook his head. No, Sophie, I don't forgive you. I don't want to work through this. I don't want another lie about how you lost yourself and how he made you feel alive again. I'm done. Sophie let out a choked sob, her hands flying to her mouth. Nathan turned to the others. Thank you for coming. I just wanted you all to know the truth before Sophie had the chance to rewrite it. Then, with one final look at the woman he had once loved, Nathan turned and walked away. For the first time in weeks, he felt free. Sophie sat motionless, staring at the divorce papers as though they were foreign objects, something distant and unreal. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, suffocating. Just days ago she had been sipping champagne by a pool, indulging in the fantasy that she could have it all, a perfect, stable marriage and the thrill of forbidden passion. But now, sitting in her own living room, surrounded by the people who once loved and trusted her, she realized something devastating. Nathan wasn't giving her the chance to explain. Her breaths hitched, and she looked up at him, her voice trembling. Nathan, please don't do this. But Nathan had already turned away, walking toward the kitchen with the quiet determination of a man who had already made his decision. The cold finality in his posture sent a fresh wave of panic through her. Her father, Henry, was the first to speak. He had always been a composed man, one who rarely raised his voice. But now he looked at his daughter as though he had never seen her before. Sophie, he said slowly, disappointment thick in his voice. Is this true? Sophie's throat tightened. Dad, Mother Eleanor closed her eyes, shaking her head. All these years you made us believe you had the perfect marriage. You made us believe Nathan was the luckiest man alive. She swallowed, looking at Nathan, guilt creeping into her expression. And now I see we were wrong. He was the one who deserved better. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. She turned to Claire, her sister, hoping for some kind of support, but Claire's expression was unreadable. Cold, detached, like she was evaluating a stranger. I don't even know what to say to you, Claire murmured. You had everything. A husband who adored you, a life most people dream of, and you threw it away for what? For Eric? Sophie winced at the name. Nathan leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. He didn't look angry anymore. If anything, that was worse, because anger meant he still felt something. But the way he looked at her now, it was like she was nothing, like she had already ceased to exist in his world. Olivia, her best friend, exhaled sharply and picked up one of the photos from the coffee table. You didn't even try to hide it, did you? She muttered, shaking her head. The whole self-care retreat excuse? That's pathetic, Sophie. Sophie bristled, heat rising to her face. You don't understand. Olivia let out a short, bitter laugh. No, Sophie, you don't understand. You don't understand what you just lost. Nathan's the kind of man who would have walked through fire for you, and you decided to burn everything down instead. Sophie pressed a hand against her forehead. She wanted to scream, to fight back, to defend herself. But how could she? The evidence was right there, sprawled across the table, in damning clarity. I made a mistake, she whispered. Nathan finally spoke. No, Sophie, a mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is buying the wrong brand of coffee. What you did was a choice. His voice was eerily calm. You made that choice every time you lied to me. Every time you planned a weekend with him. Every time you touched. Sophie bit her lip. I never stopped loving you, Nathan. He laughed, an empty, hollow sound. Is that supposed to mean something to me now? He straightened, pushing off the counter. You had your fun, Sophie. You had your self-discovery. And now you get to live with the consequences. She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, Nathan turned to her parents. I appreciate you both coming. I just wanted you to hear the truth from me before Sophie had the chance to twist it. Henry nodded slowly. I respect that, Nathan, and I'm sorry you had to go through this. He turned to his daughter, disappointment etched deep into his face. You should be ashamed, Sophie. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes. Her father had never spoken to her like that before. Claire shook her head. I don't think you realize how bad this is, Sophie. You always thought you could talk your way out of things, charm your way back into people's good graces, but not this time. This time there's no fixing it. Nathan walked over to the coffee table and picked up the divorce papers. He pulled a pen from his pocket and without hesitation signed his name on the dotted line. When he looked back at her, his expression was unreadable. I'll have my lawyer send over the details this week. I'll move out in a few days. Sophie's breath caught. Move out? No, Nathan. This is our home. He arched an eyebrow. Not anymore. For the first time since the confrontation started, true fear sank into Sophie's chest. She had always assumed that no matter what, she could fix things, that Nathan would at least give her the chance to explain. But now, as he moved through the motions with cool, methodical precision, she realized she had already lost. Eric, the thought of him suddenly made her stomach turn. Where was he now? Did he even care about what was happening? Would he be there to catch her if she fell? Probably not. Nathan glanced at the clock on the wall. I think we're done here. Olivia grabbed her purse, her expression full of disappointment. You'll regret this, Sophie, she said softly. And when you do, it'll be too late. Her parents walked out next, exchanging a brief sorrowful glance before stepping into the night. Claire lingered at the door, shaking her head one last time before leaving. And then, for the first time since she had walked through the door, Sophie was alone with Nathan. She took a shaky breath. You're really doing this? Nathan turned to her, studying her for a long moment. And then, with the finality of a closing chapter, he said, I already did. He grabbed his jacket and walked out, leaving her standing there, drowning in the wreckage of her own choices. Sophie sat in the dimly lit living room long after Nathan had left, the silence pressing against her like a heavy weight. The divorce papers lay in front of her, stark and final, as if daring her to believe that this was real. She had lost him. The house, their home, felt different now. Colder. The warmth that had always wrapped around her when she walked through the door was gone, replaced by something hollow and unfamiliar. She had built her life around the idea that Nathan would always be there, that he would always be hers. Now she realized how foolish she had been. Her phone buzzed, the sound startling in the quiet room. A flicker of hope rose in her chest. Maybe it was Nathan. Maybe he had calmed down and wanted to talk. But when she glanced at the screen, her heart dropped. It was Eric. For a long moment, she just stared at the notification. Then, with a deep breath, she answered. Sophie? Eric's voice was smooth, but there was an edge of hesitation in it. She swallowed hard. Nathan knows. A long silence, then a sigh. How bad? Sophie let out a bitter laugh. Bad enough that he served me divorce papers in front of my family. Damn, Eric muttered. Sophie closed her eyes, gripping the phone tightly. I thought you said we'd figure this out. I know, Eric said, but something about his tone felt distant. I didn't think it would come out like this. A sick feeling curled in Sophie's stomach. So what now? Eric hesitated. Look, Sophie, this was never supposed to be complicated. Her breath caught. What does that mean? It means, Eric said carefully, that I didn't sign up for a scandal. I have my own life, my own reputation to protect. I never wanted to hurt Nathan, and I sure as hell don't want my name dragged into a messy divorce. Sophie felt her body go numb. You're backing out, Eric exhaled. I think it's for the best. For both of us. She let out a hollow laugh. For both of us? You get to walk away clean, and I'm the one left with nothing. I never promised anything, Sophie, Eric said, his voice turning defensive. We had fun, but you knew what this was. Tears burned in her eyes. I thought you thought wrong, he interrupted. And then, just like that, the line went dead. Sophie stared at the screen, blinking in shock. The realization settled over her like ice. She had lost Nathan. She had lost her family's respect. She had lost her so-called lover, and she had nothing left. Nathan, meanwhile, was experiencing something he hadn't in years. Freedom. He drove with the windows down, letting the cool night air wash over him. The weight of Sophie's lies, the burden of pretending their marriage wasn't crumbling, had been lifted from his shoulders. He wasn't broken, he wasn't bitter, he was done. For the first time in a long time, Nathan allowed himself to imagine a different future, one without Sophie. A future where he didn't have to second-guess every word, every late-night excuse. A future where he came first for once. His phone buzzed. He pulled into a parking lot and glanced at the screen. It was a message from Claire, Sophie's sister. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. You deserved better. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." Nathan exhaled, shaking his head. He had spent 15 years building a life with Sophie, thinking she was his partner, his home. But now home wasn't a person. It was peace. He put the car in gear and drove away, leaving the past exactly where it belonged, behind him.